July 1942, Halifax, Nova Scotia. The evening air was thick and warm, heavy with salt from the harbor just 3 blocks away. Outside the Carlton Hotel, the street lamps had just flickered on, casting yellow light across the sidewalk. That's when the shouting started. 3 black American soldiers stood near the hotel entrance. They wore the same green uniforms as every other American GI in town. They had come to Halifax to help win the war. They wanted to get dinner at the hotel restaurant, nothing more. But 2 white military police officers had other plans. "You boys need to move along," the MP sergeant barked. He was a big man from Alabama, and his face was red with anger. "This section is whites only." Private James Thompson, a 22-year-old from Chicago, looked confused. "Sir, we just want to eat. We have money." The sergeant didn't care. He grabbed Thompson by the arm and yanked him away from the door. Thompson stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting a lamppost with a dull thud. The other MP grabbed the second soldier. Their hands were rough. Their voices were mean. A small crowd of Canadians had been walking by. They stopped. They stared. A woman in a blue dress stepped forward. Her voice cut through the summer air like a knife. "You're not in Mississippi now, Yank. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Not in Canada. Not on these streets." By the summer of 1942, the world was burning. Hitler's armies controlled most of Europe. Japan ruled the Pacific. Every week, Nazi submarines prowled the Atlantic Ocean, hunting the convoys that carried food, weapons, and hope from North America to Britain. If those convoys stopped, Britain would starve. If Britain fell, the Nazis would win. Canada sat at the center of this fight. More than 15,000 American troops were stationed across the country, especially in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. Halifax Harbor never slept. Day and night, ships gathered there, preparing to cross the deadly Atlantic. American soldiers loaded cargo, repaired equipment, and guarded the docks. They were America's front line in the north, the first step on the long road to victory. The Americans brought many things with them. They brought money that filled Canadian cash registers. They brought jazz music that poured from dance hall windows. They brought Hollywood dreams and chewing gum and confidence. They also brought something else, something darker. They brought Jim Crow. Jim Crow was the name for America's segregation laws. In the American South, black people couldn't eat in the same restaurants as white people. They couldn't sit in the same sections of buses or trains. They couldn't drink from the same water fountains. They couldn't go to the same schools, churches, or swimming pools. The law said they were separate. The law said they were less. The American military followed these same rules. Black soldiers and white soldiers served in separate units. They slept in separate barracks. They ate in separate mess halls. Even their blood was kept separate in military hospitals. 1,200,000 black Americans would serve in the war. But most would never see combat. They dug ditches, loaded trucks, and cooked food. The military said this was the natural order of things. Canada was different. Not perfect, but different. Black Canadians faced plenty of hate and unfair treatment. Some landlords wouldn't rent to them, some jobs wouldn't hire them, but there were no Jim Crow laws, no signs that said whites only. A black person could walk into any restaurant and sit down. They could ride the streetcar wherever they wanted. They could buy a ticket to any movie theater. When the American MPs started patrolling Canadian streets, they brought their rules with them. They told hotel managers to bar black soldiers from their dining rooms. They ordered dance halls to create whites-only nights. They stood guard at restaurant doors, turning away black GIs in uniform. And when black soldiers objected, the MPs used their fists and their clubs. Canadian civilians watched all of this with growing shock and anger. These black soldiers wore American uniforms. They were here to fight the same war, face the same enemy, risk the same death. How could their own people treat them this way? How could men fighting for freedom be denied the most basic dignity? Outside the Carlton Hotel that July evening, the tension cracked open like a breaking wave. The MP sergeant shoved Thompson again. The private's nose started bleeding. Red drops fell onto his uniform. The other soldiers tried to help their friend, and the second MP drew his club. More Canadians gathered, 10 people, then 20, then 30. They circled around the scene. Their faces showed anger, confusion, and disgust. Someone shouted at the MPs to stop. Another person called them bullies. A man stepped between the soldiers and the police. "Leave them alone," he said. His voice was steady and cold. "This is Canada. We don't do that here." The MPs looked at the growing crowd. They were far from their base. These were Canadian streets, Canadian people. The crowd pressed closer. For a moment, everything hung in balance. Would the MPs back down? Would the Canadians back down? Would this explode into something bigger? This moment was bigger than one hotel, one evening, one bloody nose. Across Halifax, across Canada, the same scene was playing out again and again. American MPs demanding segregation. Canadian civilians refusing. The question was simple but explosive. What happens when the country fighting for democracy treats its own soldiers like dirt? What happens when good people see injustice and have to choose? Will they look away to keep the peace with a powerful ally? Or will they stand up and say the words that would echo through the summer of 1942 and beyond? Not here, not in our country, not on our streets. To understand what happened in Halifax that summer, you need to understand the American military in 1942. It was an army split in two. Not by enemy lines or battle plans, but by the color of skin. The United States military was completely segregated. Every black soldier served in separate units from white soldiers. They had different barracks, different dining halls, different recreation areas. Even the blood banks were separated. If a black soldier donated blood, it went into bottles marked colored. If a white soldier needed a transfusion, he would never receive blood from a black donor. The military said mixing blood was dangerous, even though science proved this was a lie. 16 million Americans would serve in World War II. Of those, 1,200,000 were black men. They made up 10% of the country's population, but only 6% of combat troops. Most black soldiers never fired a shot at the enemy. Instead, they loaded cargo ships in the hot sun. They built roads through mud and rain. They cooked food, washed dishes, and drove supply trucks. They did the hard, dirty work that white soldiers didn't want to do. The Army assigned black soldiers to labor battalions, quartermaster units, and engineering companies. Almost all of their officers were white. The military said black men didn't have the intelligence or courage for combat. This wasn't true, but it was the official belief. It was written into Army regulations. It shaped every decision about where black soldiers served and what they were allowed to do. The units arriving in Canada followed this pattern. Labor battalions came to load ships. Port battalions came to handle cargo. Engineering companies came to build structures and repair roads. These men worked 12-hour shifts in the Halifax harbor, where the wind cut like ice in winter and the summer sun baked the wooden docks until they were too hot to touch. They were essential to the war effort. Without them, the convoys couldn't sail. But they were treated as less than human by their own country. Canadian civilians didn't understand this at first. In early 1942, when news spread that thousands of American soldiers were coming, people got excited. The Americans meant jobs. They meant money flowing into restaurants, shops, and dance halls. They meant hope. If the powerful United States was joining the fight, maybe Hitler could be stopped after all. Halifax merchants prepared for busy times. They ordered extra stock for their stores. Dance hall owners hired more musicians. Restaurant owners planned bigger menus. The city hadn't seen this much energy since before the war started. Young Canadian women talked about meeting handsome American soldiers. Kids collected American coins and asked GIs for chewing gum. The whole city buzzed with anticipation. The Americans brought everything people hoped for. Jazz music spilled out of nightclubs every weekend. Hollywood movies played at the theaters. GIs handed out chocolate bars to children on street corners. They filled restaurants and spent money freely. For a city that had been dark with war worry, the American presence felt like a light turning on. But there was a shadow in that light. Canada had its own problems with race. Black Canadians faced unfair treatment every day. Landlords refused to rent them apartments in certain neighborhoods. Employers passed them over for good jobs. Some people crossed the street to avoid walking near them. Prejudice existed here, quiet but real. Yet Canada had no Jim Crow laws. There were no signs that said whites only or colored section. A black person could walk into any restaurant in Halifax and order a meal. They could sit anywhere on the streetcar. They could buy a ticket to any seat in the movie theater. They could swim at public beaches. The law didn't separate people by race. Society sometimes did, but the law didn't. This created a strange situation when the Americans arrived. Black American soldiers could do things in Canada that were illegal back home. Private William Jones from Mississippi could eat at a lunch counter next to white Canadian workers. Corporal Robert Williams from Alabama could ride the streetcar without sitting in the back. Sergeant Thomas Jackson from Georgia could dance with a white Canadian woman at a Saturday night social. For many black soldiers, this was the first freedom they had ever known. They were 20 years old, 25 years old, and they had never sat in a restaurant next to a white person. They had never been called sir by a white shopkeeper. They had never walked down a street without fear of saying the wrong thing or being in the wrong place. Canadian business owners welcomed all soldiers equally. The war was on. Money was money. A man in uniform was a man in uniform. The owner of the Carlton Hotel set tables for anyone who could pay. The manager of the Vogue Cinema sold tickets to any soldier. The woman who ran the corner store served Black GIs with the same smile she gave everyone else. But the white American military police saw this as a problem. Their job was to maintain order and discipline. In their minds, order meant segregation. Discipline meant keeping black soldiers in their place. When they saw black GIs sitting in restaurants with white Canadian civilians, eating at the same tables, laughing at the same jokes, they saw chaos. They saw their whole world turning upside down. So they decided to fix it. They would bring Jim Crow to Canada. They would make sure every business knew the rules. Separate was the American way, and Canada would have to accept it. They had no idea what was about to happen. The trouble started small in the spring of 1942, then grew like a storm gathering strength over the ocean. It began in May. 2 black soldiers walked into the Capitol Theater on Barrington Street to see a movie. They bought their tickets at the window and found seats in the middle section. The film had just started when 2 white military police officers walked down the aisle. Their boots thumped on the worn carpet. They shined flashlights in the soldiers' faces. "Out," one MP said. "This theater is segregated now." The soldiers looked confused. They had been here last week without problems. The Canadian ticket seller had smiled and taken their money. Nothing had changed except these MPs standing over them. "Sir, we paid for our tickets," one soldier said. "I don't care what you paid. Out." "Now!" The theater manager, a thin Canadian man named Mr. Henderson, rushed over. He tried to explain that his theater had no separate sections. All seats were the same price. All customers were welcome. The MPs didn't listen. They grabbed the soldiers by their arms and dragged them up the aisle. Other people in the theater watched in shocked silence. The soldiers didn't fight back. They knew what happened to black men who resisted white police, even here in Canada. June brought worse incidents. MPs started visiting dance halls before weekend socials. They told the owners to set aside certain nights for white soldiers only. The Starlight Ballroom on Spring Garden Road got this visit on a Tuesday afternoon. 3 MPs walked in while the cleaning crew was mopping floors. Saturday nights are for white servicemen, the sergeant told the owner, Mrs. Patricia Murphy. You'll turn away colored soldiers at the door. Mrs. Murphy had run her dance hall for 15 years. She was a small woman with gray hair and a voice that could cut through a crowded room. I'll do no such thing, she said. All Allied soldiers are welcome here. The sergeant leaned closer. His breath smelled like coffee and cigarettes. Then you'll lose the white soldiers' business. All of it. We'll make sure they go somewhere else. Mrs. Murphy felt her hands shake, but she kept her voice steady. Then I suppose I'll lose their business. The MPs left, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Murphy needed the American soldiers' money. The war had made everything expensive. Her husband was overseas fighting. She had bills to pay. But she also had a son in the Canadian Army, and she couldn't look herself in the mirror if she turned away men in uniform because of their skin color. In late June, the crisis moved to the beaches. Chocolate Lake, just outside Halifax, had a small beach where soldiers went swimming on hot days. The water was cold and brown, but it felt good after working in the sun. One Saturday, a group of 8 black soldiers arrived with towels and swimming trunks. They had walked 3 miles from their barracks. 2 MPs were waiting. They had set up a checkpoint at the beach entrance. This beach is closed to colored troops, one said. Since when? A soldier asked. Since now. The soldiers could see white GIs swimming and laughing in the water just 50 yards away. The sun beat down. The temperature was over 80 degrees. They had been looking forward to this all week, but they turned around and walked back. What choice did they have? Fighting would mean the stockade, or worse. Canadian civilians who lived near the beach saw what happened. They told their neighbors. The story spread through Halifax like wildfire. People started talking in grocery stores, in churches, after work. Some Canadians agreed with the segregation. They said it was American business and Canada shouldn't interfere. But more people felt angry. This wasn't right. This wasn't the Canadian way. July brought everything to a breaking point. The incidents came faster now, almost daily. A black soldier turned away from a lunch counter. Another barred from a barber shop. 2 more removed from a park bench. The MPs were everywhere, enforcing rules that didn't exist in Canadian law, but felt very real to anyone who challenged them. Canadian business owners faced impossible choices every day. Take American money and enforce segregation, or stand on principle and risk losing everything. Some gave in. They put up quiet signs or told black soldiers the establishment was full when it clearly wasn't. Others resisted, and they paid the price when MPs steered white soldiers to other businesses. Canadian police officers watched these confrontations from across streets and around corners. They didn't know what to do. The MPs were foreign military on Canadian soil. Did Canadian law apply to them? Could a Halifax policeman arrest an American MP? Nobody knew for sure, so most did nothing. Then came July 6th. The evening started hot and stayed that way as the sun went down. The smell of salt water mixed with diesel fumes from the harbor. Ships' horns echoed across the city. Outside the Carlton Hotel on Hollis Street, 3 black soldiers approached the entrance at 7:30 in the evening. They wanted dinner, nothing fancy, just food. 2 MPs stood near the door. They had been waiting. Someone had tipped them off that black soldiers planned to eat here tonight. "Turn around," the sergeant said. He was the same man from Alabama who had been causing trouble for weeks. His name was Patterson, and he hated this assignment in Canada. He missed the South, where everyone knew their place. "We just want dinner, sir," Private James Thompson said. "This hotel is whites only. Now move." "But we're American soldiers, same as—" Patterson didn't let him finish. He grabbed Thompson's uniform and yanked him away from the door. Thompson stumbled backward. His shoulder hit a lamppost hard enough to rattle the glass. The second MP grabbed another soldier. A Canadian woman walking by stopped dead in her tracks. She wore a blue dress and carried a purse. Her name was Eleanor MacDonald, and she was on her way home from her job at a factory that made uniforms. She had just worked 10 hours. She was tired. But when she saw those MPs putting their hands on soldiers in Allied uniforms, something inside her snapped. "You're not in Mississippi now, Yank," she shouted. Other Canadians stopped walking. They turned to look. A small crowd began to form. The summer air felt electric, charged with anger and confusion, and the sense that something very bad or very good was about to happen. Everything hung in the balance on that street corner in Halifax. Would Canadians accept this? Would they let Jim Crow take root in their country? Or would they fight back? The crowd around the Carlton Hotel grew larger. What started as 5 or 6 people became 20, then 30. Canadians walking home from work stopped when they heard the shouting. They saw the MPs pushing the black soldiers. They saw Private Thompson's bloody nose. They didn't like what they were seeing. Mr. Robert Chen, the hotel manager, heard the commotion from inside. He was a short man with thick glasses who had run the Carlton for 12 years. He pushed through the hotel's front door and onto the street. What he saw made him angry. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Sergeant Patterson turned to face him. "Just maintaining order, sir. These colored boys need to understand. This establishment is whites only." Mr. Chen's face went red. "I decide who comes into my hotel, not you. My establishment serves all Allied servicemen. If you don't like it, then don't come here." The words hung in the air. The crowd went quiet. Everyone understood what had just happened. A Canadian business owner had just told American military police to leave. This was new. This was different. Patterson stared at Mr. Chen. His hand moved toward his club, but the crowd pressed closer. There were too many people now. The MP looked around and realized he was surrounded by angry Canadians. He grabbed his partner's arm. "This isn't over," Patterson said. He and the other MP pushed through the crowd and walked away. Mr. Chen helped Thompson to his feet. "Come inside," he said. "I'll get you cleaned up and get you that dinner you came for." That night, Mr. Chen wrote a letter. He sent copies to the mayor, to the newspaper, and to the American Military Command. The letter said his hotel would never segregate. Any soldier in Allied uniform could eat in his dining room, sleep in his rooms, and drink in his bar. The color of their skin didn't matter. Within 3 days, other business owners followed. Mrs. Murphy at the Starlight Ballroom posted a sign in her window. It said, "All Allied forces welcome, no exceptions." She wrote the words herself in neat black letters. The sign stayed up for the rest of the war. The owner of the Capitol Theater, Mr. Henderson, did the same. He told his ticket sellers that all seats were available to all soldiers. When MPs came to complain, he asked them politely to leave. If they didn't like his policy, they could watch movies somewhere else. The rebellion was spreading, but it wasn't peaceful. The real explosion came on July 7th, the very next night. The Starlight Ballroom was packed that Saturday. The band played swing music that made the wooden floor shake. Soldiers danced with Canadian women under spinning lights. The air smelled like perfume and sweat. About 200 people filled the hall. Among the dancers was Corporal David Wilson, a black soldier from the 808th Engineer Battalion. He was 23 years old and had never been to a real dance back home in Georgia. In the South, black men couldn't dance with white women. It was against the law. But here in Halifax, a young Canadian woman named Mary Sullivan had asked him to dance. She had red hair and a green dress. They were laughing, moving to the music, just two young people enjoying a Saturday night. 3 MPs walked into the ballroom at 9 o'clock. Sergeant Patterson was leading them again. They had come looking for trouble, and they found it fast. Patterson walked straight across the dance floor. He grabbed Corporal Wilson by the shoulder and yanked him away from Mary. "You're under arrest," Patterson said. "For what?" Wilson asked. His voice was shaking. "Fraternizing with white civilians, causing a disturbance." Mary Sullivan stepped forward. She was barely 5 feet tall, but she was furious. "He wasn't causing anything. We were just dancing." "Stay out of this, miss," Patterson said. The music stopped. The whole ballroom went silent. Everyone was watching now. The other MPs moved in to help Patterson. They grabbed Wilson's arms and started dragging him toward the door. That's when the Canadians moved. A man in work clothes blocked the MP's path. "Let him go," he said. "This is military business," Patterson snarled. "This is our dance hall, in our city, in our country." More Canadians stepped forward. They formed a human wall between the MPs and the exit. 10 people, 20, 30. The crowd grew bigger by the second. Some were men who worked at the shipyards. Some were women still in their factory uniforms. Some were older folks who had come to watch the dancing. Patterson tried to push through, but the crowd wouldn't move. They locked arms. They stood firm. Someone shouted, "Leave him alone!" Another person yelled, "This is Canada, not Georgia." The MPs dragged Wilson toward their vehicle parked outside. The crowd followed. More than 50 Canadians poured out of the dance hall and surrounded the military police car. They stood in front of it, behind it, on all sides. Patterson couldn't drive away without running people over. For 10 long minutes, nobody moved. The MPs stood by their car. The Canadians stood around it. Corporal Wilson stood in the middle, not sure what was happening or what would happen next. The summer night was warm, but he felt cold all over. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. Then the Halifax police arrived. 2 officers in Canadian uniforms walked up to the scene. Everyone held their breath. Would the Canadian police help the American MPs? Would they clear the crowd? The senior Canadian officer looked at Patterson. Then he looked at Wilson. Then he looked at the crowd of 50-plus citizens. "What seems to be the problem?" the Canadian officer asked. Patterson explained that he was arresting a soldier for fraternizing. The Canadian officer listened. When Patterson finished, the Canadian shook his head. "That's not against Canadian law," he said. "I can't help you arrest someone who hasn't broken our laws." Patterson's face went purple. "This is military jurisdiction." "Not on our streets it isn't. Let the soldier go." The crowd erupted in cheers. Patterson had no choice. He released Wilson and got in his car. The crowd parted just enough to let the vehicle through. As the MPs drove away, Canadians clapped and shouted. Some hugged Corporal Wilson. Mary Sullivan took his hand. The news spread through Halifax like lightning. By Sunday morning, everyone knew what had happened. The mayor, Alan Butler, called a press conference. He stood on the City Hall steps and spoke to reporters and citizens. "Canadian businesses will not segregate on orders from foreign military police," he declared. "We welcome all Allied servicemen to our city. We will not participate in policies that contradict our values. In the provincial capital, Premier Angus MacDonald quietly contacted Ottawa. He told federal officials that American military police were overstepping their authority. Something needed to be done before this got worse. Canadian military liaison officers met with American commanders. They delivered a simple message. Canadian law doesn't recognize racial segregation. Canadian civilians won't enforce it. If American MPs keep causing incidents, there will be serious diplomatic problems. The American commanders were stuck. They couldn't enforce Jim Crow without Canadian help, but they also couldn't allow integrated socializing without making white Southern soldiers and politicians angry. They tried to create a middle path. They designated certain recreation areas as unofficially segregated. They told white soldiers to go to certain dance halls and black soldiers to go to others. But Canadians ignored these designations completely. Black soldiers kept going to the Starlight Ballroom, the Carlton Hotel, the Capitol Theatre, and everywhere else. Canadian civilians kept welcoming them. Back at the Carlton Hotel, Mr. Chen did something unexpected. He wrote a handwritten letter to Private James Thompson. He apologized for the violence Thompson had experienced outside his hotel. He gave Thompson a card for free drinks for the next month. "Thank you for your service," the letter said. "You are always welcome here." Canadian women started organizing social events specifically for Black GIs. They sent invitations to the segregated units. They made sure these soldiers knew they were wanted and welcome. Some Canadian families invited black soldiers to Sunday dinners. They set extra places at their tables and served roast beef and potatoes and pie. For the first time, ordinary Canadians had said no to their powerful American allies. They had drawn a line. They had said, "Not here." And it changed everything. The days after the Starlight Ballroom incident brought swift changes, but not everyone was happy about them. Within a week, Sergeant Patterson disappeared from Halifax streets. Nobody made an official announcement. He was just gone. The same thing happened to two other MPs who had been causing the most trouble. They were quietly reassigned to bases in the American South, far from Canada. The American military didn't want to admit there was a problem, but they also didn't want more confrontations with angry Canadian crowds. By the end of July, new orders came down from American command. The orders were carefully worded, never admitting that anything had gone wrong. But the message was clear. Military police should focus on actual crimes, not on which restaurant soldiers ate in or who they danced with. MPs should avoid enforcing segregation in Canadian civilian establishments. It wasn't worth the trouble. But inside American military bases, nothing changed. The barracks were still segregated. The mess halls were still divided. Black soldiers and white soldiers still lived in separate worlds when they were on base. The difference was that now, when they left base and went into Halifax or other Canadian towns, those walls came down. Not all American soldiers accepted this. Some white troops from the Deep South were furious. They had grown up believing that segregation was natural law, something ordained by God Himself. Seeing black soldiers eating at the same lunch counters, dancing with white women, being treated as equals made them angry in a way they couldn't always control. Fights broke out between white and black American soldiers. These happened mostly on base or in areas between base and town. A white soldier would make a comment. A black soldier would respond. Fists would fly. Sometimes bottles were thrown. Sometimes knives came out. The violence was ugly and personal. One night in August, 3 white soldiers jumped a black private named Robert Hayes as he walked back to base from town. They beat him badly, breaking 2 of his ribs and blackening both his eyes. When the Canadian police found him, he was unconscious in an alley. The white soldiers were caught and punished, but the incident showed that hatred didn't disappear just because Canadians refused to support it. Canadian newspapers started writing about what was happening. The Halifax Chronicle ran a long editorial that people talked about for weeks. The writer's words were simple but powerful. If these men are good enough to die for democracy, they're good enough to eat in our restaurants. The newspaper printed letters from readers. Most supported the city's stance against segregation. One woman wrote, "My son is fighting overseas. These American soldiers are his allies. How can we turn them away?" Not everyone agreed. Some letters to the newspaper said, "Canada should mind its own business." "Let the Americans handle their own people their own way," one man wrote. "We have enough problems without getting involved in their racial issues." A few restaurant owners complained that they had lost business from white soldiers who were angry about integrated establishments. Churches became unexpected allies for black soldiers. Ministers at several Halifax churches organized Sunday socials where Black GIs were specifically invited as guests of honor. The First Baptist Church hosted a dinner for 30 black soldiers in late July. Canadian families brought food and shared stories. Children played together in the churchyard, not caring about the color of anyone's skin. One minister said from his pulpit, "Christ taught us that all men are brothers. We cannot call ourselves Christians while treating some brothers as less than others." For American military officers, the situation was complicated. Some white officers quietly welcomed what was happening. They had never believed in segregation, but had to follow military policy. One captain from Pennsylvania wrote in his diary, "The racial tension has decreased since the Canadians refused to cooperate with our segregation policies. The men seem happier, morale is better. Perhaps there's a lesson here that our generals refuse to learn." Other officers resented what they called Canadian interference. They felt that discipline was breaking down. A colonel from Virginia complained in an official report that local civilians are undermining military authority and creating dangerous expectations among Negro troops. He worried that black soldiers would return to the United States expecting the same treatment they received in Canada, and that would cause problems. The black soldiers themselves experienced something many had never imagined possible. Private William Jones from Mississippi wrote a letter home to his mother. His words were carefully chosen because he knew military censors would read them, but his meaning was clear. "For the first time in my life, I can walk into any restaurant and sit down. The people here treat me like a man in uniform, not a colored boy. I wish you could see it, Mama. I wish this was how things were everywhere." Corporal David Wilson and the soldier from the Starlight Ballroom incident kept going back to dance. Mary Sullivan, the Canadian woman with red hair, kept dancing with him. They became friends, then more than friends. By September, they were talking about a future together. This wasn't unusual. Several black soldiers started dating Canadian women. Some relationships were casual, just wartime romance. Others grew deeper. The thought of marriage crossed some minds, though everyone knew the challenges that would bring in either country. Canadian families opened their homes. The Morrison family in Halifax invited 3 black soldiers to Sunday dinner every week through the fall of 1942. Mrs. Morrison said later, "They were so far from home. They were so grateful for a home-cooked meal and some kindness. It cost us nothing to be decent human beings." But Canada wasn't paradise. Not every Canadian welcomed black soldiers. Some restaurants still refused to serve them, though they did it quietly without signs or announcements. Some landlords wouldn't rent rooms to Black GIs looking for off-base housing. Some Canadian women who dated black soldiers faced cruel comments and cold stares from neighbors. A young woman named Sarah Chen, daughter of the Carlton hotel manager, started seeing a black sergeant named Thomas Wright. Her friends stopped talking to her. Someone threw a rock through her bedroom window with a note that said ugly words. Her father stood by her choice, but he worried about her safety. The cost of resistance was real for Canadians who took a stand. Mrs. Murphy's dance hall lost money when white American soldiers stopped coming. She had to cut her staff hours and take on extra work herself. Some nights, only 20 people showed up when she used to host 200. But she kept her doors open to everyone. Military reports from the fall of 1942 showed something interesting. American bases in Canada reported fewer racial incidents than bases in the American South or even northern cities. Fights still happened, but less often. Black soldiers' morale was higher. Desertion rates were lower. When commanders looked at the numbers, they showed that integrated civilian areas didn't cause the chaos segregationists predicted. Canadian police records told another story. American MPs filed complaint after complaint about lack of local cooperation with military regulations. The reports were frustrated and angry. One MP wrote, "Canadian civilians actively encourage fraternization between white civilians and Negro soldiers. Local police refused to assist in maintaining proper order." The complaints went nowhere. Canadian officials filed them away and ignored them. By the end of summer, an uneasy balance had formed. On American bases, segregation remained the rule. But in Canadian towns, black soldiers moved freely. They ate where they wanted, went to movies, danced at halls, walked the streets with dignity. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice still existed. Danger still lurked. But for men who had grown up under Jim Crow, this taste of freedom was like water in a desert. Private James Thompson, and the soldier who had been beaten outside the Carlton Hotel, received Mr. Chen's letter offering free drinks. He went back to the hotel the next Saturday. He sat at the bar and ordered a beer. The bartender served him with a smile. Other soldiers, both black and white, sat nearby. Nobody bothered him. Nobody told him to leave. He drank his beer slowly, savoring both the taste and the simple dignity of being treated like any other customer. For 1 year, in one place, ordinary people had refused to participate in injustice. The question now was whether it would last, and what it would mean for the future. What happened in Halifax during the summer and fall of 1942 sent ripples across the Atlantic and around the world. The effects reached far beyond one Canadian city. American military officers started paying attention to something they hadn't expected. Reports from Canadian bases showed a pattern that contradicted everything segregationists believed. When black and white soldiers used the same restaurants, theaters, and dance halls in Canadian towns, the sky didn't fall. Society didn't collapse. In fact, things ran more smoothly than on segregated American bases. A major from Pennsylvania named Robert Morrison kept detailed notes about what he observed. He commanded a mixed supply unit that coordinated between black labor battalions and white transport companies. Both groups spent their off-duty time in Halifax. Morrison watched carefully and wrote down what he saw. Black and white soldiers sat in the same movie theaters without fighting. They ate in the same restaurants without incidents. They walked the same streets, shopped in the same stores, and drank in the same bars. When problems did happen, they were the normal problems soldiers everywhere caused: getting too drunk, staying out past curfew, getting into arguments over card games. The problems had nothing to do with race mixing. Morrison's reports went up the chain of command. Most generals ignored them. They had spent their whole careers believing that segregation prevented violence and maintained discipline. Facts that contradicted this belief made them uncomfortable. But a few officers read Morrison's reports carefully. they filed them away in their minds. Years later, when the military finally integrated, some of these officers would remember what they learned in Canada. British military observers stationed in Canada saw the same thing. They wrote reports back to London describing how Canadian civilians handled American segregation demands. The British reports were blunt. Local populations refused to enforce American racial codes. Result: decreased tensions, improved morale among Negro troops, no significant disruption to public order. Britain's military was also segregated, though less strictly than America's. Thousands of soldiers from British colonies in Africa and the Caribbean served in the war. British commanders wondered if they should reconsider their own policies. The Canadian example suggested that integration might work better than separation. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America's enemies were watching. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan ran powerful propaganda operations. They searched constantly for ways to make America look bad, to weaken American morale and turn neutral countries against the Allies. The American segregation story was perfect for their purposes. Nazi radio broadcasts told listeners in Europe and Africa about how America treated black soldiers. The Americans claim they fight for freedom and democracy, the announcers said in German, French, and Arabic. But they treat their own Negro soldiers worse than dogs. They segregate them, humiliate them, deny them basic human dignity. Japanese propaganda did the same thing across Asia and the Pacific. Radio Tokyo told listeners, America says it fights for justice, but look how they treat colored people in their own military. Is this the freedom they want to bring to Asia? These propaganda attacks hurt American credibility, especially with non-white populations around the world. How could America claim moral authority against Hitler's racial theories while practicing its own form of racial separation? The contradiction was obvious to everyone. The Canadian stance became a small propaganda victory for the Allies. When Nazi radio talked about American segregation, some broadcasts mentioned that Canada refused to enforce it. This showed cracks in the story. It proved that not all allies supported American racism. It was a tiny positive in an otherwise embarrassing situation. The morale effects among soldiers were clear and measurable. Black troops stationed in Canada reported higher morale than those stationed anywhere in the United States. Military surveys asked soldiers about their satisfaction with service conditions. Black soldiers in Canadian deployments gave higher scores in almost every category. Letters from black soldiers stationed in Canada had a different tone than letters from those in the American South. Men in Canada wrote about feeling respected, being treated fairly, having positive interactions with civilians. Men in the South wrote about anger, frustration, and constant humiliation. Re-enlistment became a telling measure. When black soldiers finished their initial service commitment, they could choose to re-enlist or go home. Those who had served in Canada re-enlisted at higher rates than those who served elsewhere. Some specifically requested assignment back to Canadian bases. A corporal named James Butler from Alabama wrote on his re-enlistment papers, "I request assignment to Canadian theater if possible." When his commanding officer asked why, Butler was honest. "Sir, I'm treated like a soldier there, not like a problem." Some black soldiers wanted to stay in Canada permanently, even after the war ended. They asked about immigration requirements. They wrote to Canadian officials asking about job opportunities. A few even started learning about Canadian citizenship. The idea of never returning to Jim Crow America was powerfully attractive. White soldiers from the South had the opposite reaction. They wrote angry letters home and to their congressmen. They complained that discipline was breaking down. They said black soldiers were getting uppity and forgetting their place. One private from Mississippi wrote, "They let Negroes eat in the same restaurants as white people here. It ain't right. It ain't natural." These complaints reached politicians in Washington. Southern senators and congressmen demanded that the military enforce proper segregation even in Canada. But the military couldn't enforce it without Canadian cooperation, and that cooperation would never come. By the war's end in 1945, more than 30,000 black American servicemen would pass through Canadian bases. The number was significant. 30,000 men who experienced something different from Jim Crow, who saw another way of living, who carried that knowledge back home. The vast majority of these men reported positive experiences with Canadian civilians. Military exit surveys showed that black soldiers rated Canadian deployments higher than any other overseas posting. They praised the fairness, the respect, and the simple human decency they received. The statistics told another important story. Desertion rates among black troops in Canada were significantly lower than among black troops in the American South. Desertion, running away from military service, was a serious crime. It happened when soldiers felt so miserable, so trapped, that they risked court-martial and prison to escape. In southern bases, the desertion rate among black soldiers ran about 8%. In Canadian deployments, it was less than 2%. The difference was striking. When treated with basic respect, black soldiers wanted to stay and do their jobs. When treated as inferior, some felt desperate enough to risk everything to get away. The international effects rippled across the British Commonwealth. Australia and New Zealand would soon host American troops preparing for Pacific operations. Officials in both countries heard about the Canadian situation. They discussed how to handle American segregation demands. Should they allow American MPs to enforce Jim Crow in Sydney and Auckland? Should they let Americans segregate their restaurants and dance halls? The debates were intense. Both countries faced the same choice Canada had faced. Most Commonwealth nations followed Canada's example. They told American commanders that local laws didn't recognize racial segregation. They said their civilians wouldn't enforce it. Some did this quietly, to avoid diplomatic fights. Others did it publicly, making clear statements about their values. The cumulative effect was important. Across multiple countries, millions of people saw that integrated facilities didn't cause disaster. They saw black and white soldiers coexisting peacefully when given the chance. They saw that segregation was a choice, not a necessity. American military leadership drew their own conclusions, though these varied wildly. Some generals looked at the evidence and began questioning segregation. Others doubled down, insisting the policy was correct and blaming problems on outside interference. The debate over military segregation would continue for 6 more years after the war ended. But the seeds of change had been planted in Canadian soil during the summer of 1942. The question was whether those seeds would grow. The war ended in 1945, but the stories of the people who lived through those days in Halifax continued for decades. Private James Thompson returned to Mississippi in late 1945. He had spent 3 years in the Army, most of it in Canada. The train ride from New York to Jackson took 2 days. As the train crossed from the north into the south, Thompson watched the signs change. Whites only appeared on water fountains. Colored waiting room marked separate areas in train stations. He was back in Jim Crow country. Thompson got a job at a lumber mill. He married his high school sweetheart, Sarah. They had 3 children. He worked hard, kept his head down, and tried to live a quiet life. But he never forgot Canada. He never forgot walking into the Carlton Hotel and being served at the same table as white customers. He never forgot Canadian women dancing with black soldiers without fear. He never forgot what it felt like to be treated like a man. In 1962, when the civil rights movement reached Mississippi, Thompson was 42 years old. He joined the local chapter of the NAACP. He marched in protests. He registered black voters even though it was dangerous. White supremacists burned crosses in his yard. Someone shot bullets through his living room window. But Thompson kept going. When people asked him why he risked so much, he talked about Canada. "I lived it," he would say. "I saw black and white people eating in the same restaurants, sitting in the same movie theaters. The world didn't end, society didn't fall apart. It worked just fine. So I know Jim Crow is a lie. I've seen the truth." In Halifax, a black Canadian woman named Viola Desmond watched what happened in 1942. She ran a beauty school and salon for black women. She saw how Canadian civilians welcomed black American soldiers while those same soldiers were beaten by their own military police. The contrast made her think hard about discrimination in Canada. In 1946, 4 years after the Halifax incidents, Desmond was in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. She went to see a movie. The theater had an unofficial policy. Black people were supposed to sit in the balcony, white people on the main floor. Desmond bought a main floor ticket and sat down. An usher told her to move. She refused. The police were called. They dragged her out of the theater and threw her in jail overnight. She was charged with tax evasion because the main floor ticket cost 1 cent more tax than the balcony ticket. Desmond fought the charge in court and lost. But her case became famous across Canada. People remembered how Canadians had stood up for black American soldiers. Now, a black Canadian woman was being arrested for sitting in a movie theater. The hypocrisy was obvious. Desmond's case helped spark the Canadian civil rights movement. She died in 1965, but her legacy lived on. In 2018, the Canadian government put her face on the $10 bill. She became a national hero, partly because she fought for the same dignity that Canadians had defended for black American GIs. Captain John Roosevelt Robinson was a black officer assigned to Canadian liaison work. This job put him in an impossible position. On American bases, he ate in segregated mess halls and slept in segregated quarters. But when he worked with Canadian officials, they invited him to their homes, their clubs, their restaurants. He ate dinner with white Canadian officers and their families. Robinson kept a detailed diary through 1942 and 1943. His entries showed the daily contradictions. Monday, briefing at base, used colored officers' latrine. Tuesday, lunch with Canadian Major Peters at his club, sat at main dining room. Wednesday, told I cannot use officers' recreation room on base. Thursday, invited to Canadian Thanksgiving dinner, seated between Major's wife and daughter. How long can a man live in two worlds? After the war, Robinson became a lawyer. He used his diary as evidence in civil rights cases. He testified before Congress about military segregation. His words carried weight because he had lived the contradictions. Margaret McLeod was a Halifax schoolteacher who organized weekend dances for Black GIs after witnessing the violence in July 1942. She recruited other Canadian women to help. They rented church halls, hired bands, and sent invitations directly to segregated black units. McLeod also helped black soldiers who wanted to immigrate to Canada after the war. She wrote letters of recommendation, helped them find jobs, and connected them with landlords who would rent to them. At least 15 black American veterans settled permanently in Halifax with her help. One of them, Sergeant Thomas Wright, married Margaret's friend Sarah Chen. They opened a restaurant together in 1947. The restaurant served everyone, no exceptions. It stayed in business for 40 years. Not all stories were inspiring. Corporal William Davis was a white military police officer from Georgia. His job was enforcing segregation. He believed in it when he arrived in Canada. It was how he was raised. But watching Canadian civilians refuse to cooperate made him uncomfortable. Davis saw the Starlight Ballroom incident. He watched 50 Canadians surround the MPs and refused to let them arrest Corporal Wilson. He saw that these Canadians weren't bad people or troublemakers. They were normal folks who just thought segregation was wrong. Davis returned to Georgia in 1944. He went back to his hometown, got married, and ran his family's hardware store. He never became a civil rights activist. He never marched or protested, but he also never again said that segregation was natural or right. His children later said he was the only white man in their town who quietly supported integration in the 1960s. Canadian families who hosted Black GIs often stayed in touch for years. The Morrison family from Halifax exchanged Christmas cards with 3 soldiers they had hosted for Sunday dinners. One soldier, Private Robert Hayes, sent them a birth announcement when his first child was born. Mrs. Morrison sent baby clothes. The connection lasted until she died in 1978. Even enemy soldiers noticed the difference. German prisoners of war were held in camps across Canada. Some had black American soldiers as guards. The German POWs wrote letters home describing something strange. The black guards were treated better by Canadian civilians than by their own white American officers. This confused the Germans, who had been told that all non-white people were inferior. But the evidence was right in front of them. One German prisoner, named Hans Richter, wrote in a letter, "The local Canadians speak with the Negro guards as equals. They offer them cigarettes and friendly conversation, but the white American officers treat these same guards with contempt. I do not understand this war anymore." These were the human faces behind the statistics and policies. Each person carried their experience forward into the future. Some became activists. Some became quiet supporters. Some simply remembered. But none of them forgot what happened in Halifax during the summer of 1942. When the war ended in 1945, thousands of Black American veterans came home from Canada. They carried with them a dangerous knowledge. They had seen a different way of living. They knew segregation wasn't natural law or divine order. It was a choice, and it could be changed. Several hundred black veterans decided not to go back to the United States at all. They applied for Canadian immigration and settled permanently in Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, and other cities. The Canadian government accepted them. These men found jobs, married, raised families, and became Canadian citizens. They brought their American military experience and their memories of how things could be different. Life in Canada wasn't perfect for them. They still faced discrimination in housing and employment. Some businesses still refused to serve them. But there were no Jim Crow laws, no separate water fountains, no whites-only signs. For men who grew up in Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama, this was freedom enough. One veteran named Charles Washington settled in Halifax in 1946. He got a job at the shipyard where he had worked during the war. He married a Canadian woman and had 4 children. In a 1982 interview, when he was 63 years old, he said, "I never regretted staying. In Canada, I could be a man. My children could go to any school. That was worth everything." Back in the United States, the Canadian experience became a quiet part of the military integration debate. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which ordered the desegregation of the armed forces. The military resisted for years, but the process had begun. Some officers who supported integration pointed to overseas deployments as proof that it could work. They didn't always mention Canada by name, but the evidence was there in military reports. Integrated civilian areas in Canada, Britain, and France showed lower racial tensions than segregated American bases. When one general argued that integration would destroy discipline, another general pulled out statistics from Canadian deployments showing this wasn't true. The change came slowly. The Korean War, which started in 1950, forced the military's hand. Combat units were integrated by necessity, not by choice. There weren't enough white soldiers to fill some units, and enough black soldiers to fill others. Commanders mixed them together to survive. And it worked. The integrated units fought just as well as segregated units had, often better. By 1954, the American military was officially integrated. Black and white soldiers served together in the same units, ate in the same mess halls, and slept in the same barracks. The system that seemed permanent and unchangeable in 1942 was gone. The Canadian example hadn't caused this change, but it had been one small piece of evidence that change was possible. In Canada, the Halifax incidents were largely forgotten by mainstream history. Canadian history textbooks focused on bigger World War II stories, the battles, the leaders, the victory. The summer of 1942, when ordinary Canadians stood up to American military police, didn't make it into most books. But in Nova Scotia's black communities, the story survived. Grandparents told grandchildren about the American soldiers who were welcomed when their own country rejected them. The stories became part of local memory, passed down through families and church congregations. In 2019, something changed. A group of historians and community activists in Halifax pushed for recognition of what had happened. They researched old newspaper articles, military reports, and personal letters. They interviewed the children and grandchildren of people who had been there. The city of Halifax agreed to install a small plaque near where the Carlton Hotel once stood. The hotel had been torn down in 1978, replaced by an office building, but the location mattered. The plaque's words were simple. In 1942, this city welcomed all Allied servicemen, regardless of race, standing against segregation when others demanded it. Halifax chose dignity over discrimination. The plaque wasn't a major monument. Most people walking by didn't notice it. But it marked a moment when ordinary people had made a choice that mattered. The broader lesson of Halifax reached beyond Canada or even World War II. It showed that segregation and discrimination weren't inevitable. They were maintained by laws, by violence, and by people willing to enforce them. When people refused to enforce them, the whole system weakened. The Canadian civilians who surrounded that military police car at the Starlight Ballroom hadn't ended racism. They hadn't solved America's problems or even Canada's problems, but they had created a small space where dignity was possible. They had drawn a line and said, "Not here, not in our city." This mattered because it showed that ordinary people had power. The business owners, the dance hall operators, the families who invited soldiers to Sunday dinner, they weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They didn't storm beaches or win medals, but they refused to participate in injustice, and that refusal made a difference. The story also revealed the hypocrisy at the heart of the Allied cause. America claimed to fight for freedom and democracy against Nazi racial theories, but America practiced its own form of racial segregation, written into law and enforced by violence. The contrast between American words and American actions was stark. When the United States finally began to address this contradiction, it wasn't because of moral awakening alone. It was because the contradiction became too embarrassing to ignore, too damaging to American credibility. The Canadian example was one small piece of evidence that the country's enemies used in propaganda and that civil rights activists used in arguments. For the Black veterans who experienced Canada, the impact was deeply personal. They carried the memory for the rest of their lives. They told their children and grandchildren about the year when they were treated as equals. Some used that memory as fuel for civil rights activism. Others simply held it quietly as proof that a better world was possible. Private William Jones, who had written to his mother about being able to walk into any restaurant, returned to Mississippi after the war. He worked as a postal clerk for 30 years. He raised 5 children. He lived through the violent resistance to civil rights in the 1960s. In 1985, a journalist interviewed Jones for an oral history project about Black veterans. Jones was 65 years old then, his hair white, his hands shaking slightly, but his memory of Canada was crystal clear. "I fought for democracy in a Jim Crow army," he said, "but for 1 year in Halifax, I lived in it. That's what I was fighting for. That's what I wanted to bring home." The journalist asked if he felt bitter about the contrast between Canada and Mississippi. Jones was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not bitter. I'm grateful. Grateful that I got to see it, even for just a year. Because once you've lived in freedom, even for a short time, you can never forget what it feels like, and you can never stop wanting it for everyone." In a Halifax attic in 2018, a woman cleaning out her grandmother's house found an old photograph. It showed 3 Black American soldiers sitting at a restaurant table with a Canadian family. Everyone was smiling. The photo was dated December 1943, while on the back someone had written in faded ink, "Christmas dinner with our American friends. All men are equal under God." The photo was donated to the Nova Scotia Archives. It now sits in a collection of World War II materials, one image among thousands. But it captures something important, a moment when the promise of equality was kept, at least for the people in that room, at least for that meal. The Halifax story doesn't have a neat ending. Racism didn't disappear in Canada or America. Many of the soldiers who experienced that brief freedom returned to lives of discrimination and injustice. The changes they hoped for took decades to arrive, and even now remain incomplete. But the story matters because it shows that change is possible. It shows that when people choose dignity over discrimination, when they refuse to participate in injustice even at personal cost, they create ripples that spread farther than they can imagine. In July 1942, a crowd of Canadians surrounded a military police car and said, "Not here." Those 2 words echoed across decades, carried in the memories of veterans, whispered to children, recorded in letters and diaries. They became proof that ordinary people can resist, can refuse, can choose a different path. And sometimes that's enough to change the world.